It was a dusty morning in Kunu, the village where legends rest and memories still breathe through the wind. An elderly man walks alone down a narrow gravel path. His steps are slow, deliberate, not because of age, but because of the weight he carries in silence. His name is Saifo Mazabuko. For years, the public knew him simply as the man in the background, the silent shadow always behind Nelson Mandela. But today, Saifo isn't a bodyguard anymore. Today, he's a storyteller. And what he's about to reveal, he's kept buried for decades. Not out of fear, but out of loyalty. The camera zooms in on his trembling hand, holding an envelope, sealed since 1994. A letter Mandela gave him and told him never to open, until the time was right. The story begins in the early 90s. Years of transition, turbulence, and tension. Saifo wasn't just a bodyguard. He was a silent witness to every whispered conversation, every private tear, every unspoken fear that Mandela carried. You see things others don't, Mandela once told him, because you're never trying to be seen. In hotel hallways, inside armored cars, behind podium curtains, Saifo saw the private Mandela, the one who questioned himself, the one who sometimes wept in silence after speeches that moved the world. But there was one night, one unforgettable night, in a Cape Town hotel room. Mandela handed Saifo a letter. "Keep this," he said, "not for the world I live in, but for the one that comes after." Saifo never asked what was in it. That wasn't his role, but he kept it sealed for 30 years. Saifo had avoided the media for decades. Offers came, reporters begged, producers made promises. He said nothing, until one journalist from a small community radio station asked a simple question during a grocery run. "Do you ever miss him?" Saifo paused. He didn't say yes or no. He just nodded slowly, and then asked the young man to meet him the next day. Inside the dim radio booth, with nothing but a mic and a cup of tea between them, Saifo told the world, "There's a truth Mandela didn't take to the grave. He left it with me." The radio station cut to music. Listeners held their breath. And then he said it. "Tomorrow, I will open the letter." South Africa froze. That night, Cape Town didn't breathe. The streetlights flickered in solemn rhythm. The hum of traffic was absent. The city had grown quiet, as if sensing that something long buried was about to rise. Saifo sat at the edge of his modest bed, surrounded by ghosts. On the walls hung aging photographs, one of him standing just behind Nelson Mandela at the 1994 inauguration, another of him in uniform, stone-faced, watching the crowd. On the table, untouched for 30 years, lay the envelope, yellowed slightly by time, sealed with wax. Mandela had handed it to him with a whisper. "You are invisible in the way that matters, Saifo. That's why I trust you." He had guarded it with his life, through administrations, through scandals, through revolutions that never reached the newspapers. But something inside him had shifted. The world outside had changed. The ideals he once protected had frayed. He reached for the envelope as if touching a relic, but it felt more like touching a wound. His fingers trembled. His heart didn't. He sat in silence, staring at it, not for minutes, but for hours. Then, as the wind nudged the curtain and the night cracked open with the howling of distant dogs, Saifo whispered to himself, "Madiba, forgive me, but this cannot stay hidden." He placed the envelope into his inside coat pocket, then stood up slowly, like a man rising not from sleep, but from memory. In the distance, the first birds of dawn began to sing. A new day was coming, but it would not be a peaceful one. The local community radio station was never meant for this. It was a place for birthday dedications, traffic reports, and township jazz. But today, it had become the heart of a nation. Outside, dozens of reporters crowded the narrow streets. Inside, the studio lights buzzed. A single camera recorded, and across the mic sat Saifo, wearing the same gray suit he wore the day Mandela was freed. He placed the envelope gently on the desk. For a moment, he said nothing. He just looked at it, as if expecting it to speak first. Then, in one slow breath, he broke the seal. The sound was soft, but in the minds of those watching, it cracked like thunder. He unfolded the heavy paper, hands steady, eyes sharp. He began to read, "To the people of South Africa, and to the generations that will judge me." The words were Mandela's, unmistakable. Saifo paused. The room was still. Then he continued, his voice no longer just reading, but trembling. "In 1993, I was approached with an ultimatum. Either I lead the nation in peace, or I do not live to lead it at all." Gasps were heard. One journalist dropped his pen. Another turned pale. Saifo pressed on. "I made a deal with men whose names you will never know. Men who would rather see a silent peace than a noisy justice. I chose silence, and I have lived with that silence as my shadow." Saifo's voice cracked. He paused again, not to catch his breath, but to hold back tears. "Today I give you this truth, not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary." The paper shook in his hands. For a moment, the entire country seemed to hold its breath. Saifo looked up, straight into the camera, and with eyes that had seen both the beauty and betrayal of a nation's soul, he said softly, "The truth always costs something, but silence has cost us more." The news didn't spread, it detonated. What had begun as a quiet radio broadcast was now a wildfire tearing through South African consciousness. Cell phones buzzed in classrooms. Taxis stopped mid-route. Factory workers, lawyers, fruit vendors, ministers, every social layer froze under the weight of the same sentence echoing through radios and television screens. "Mandela's hidden letter has been read." In Soweto, an old man sat on a plastic chair outside his home, weeping silently. He had marched with Mandela once. He had scars to prove it. In Pretoria, a young law student rewatched the footage over and over, trying to understand the implications. In Durban, mothers turned down their stoves to hear every word. And in Parliament, chaos erupted. Ministers whispered. Advisors ran down corridors. Phones rang in unison like sirens. Those who had always branded Saifo a nobody were now staring at the screen with faces drained of color. A single letter, undeniably Mandela's, was now challenging the official history. On social media, #Mandela letter surged to #1. But this wasn't about hashtags anymore. This was about trust, legacy, and fear. In a private villa in Stellenbosch, a retired intelligence officer dropped his whiskey glass. He had recognized a name in the letter, one that was never supposed to see the light of day. Outside, the sun kept shining, but it no longer felt like daylight. It felt like exposure. Late that night, Saifo sat alone in his cousin's flat in Athlone. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the studio. He just stared out the window, watching headlights crawl across the freeway like nervous fireflies. Then the landline rang. He didn't move. It rang again. On the third ring, he picked it up. The voice on the other end was low, formal. "Mr. Saifo Dlamini, the president would like to speak with you, privately." Saifo didn't answer. The voice continued. "A car will pick you up in 20 minutes. Then the line went dead. Saifo sat there, holding the phone, as the silence around him grew heavier. 20 minutes later, a black SUV with no plates stopped in front of the building. Saifo got in without a word. The drive was silent. The driver never looked back. The car passed checkpoints without stopping. Then it entered the secured gates of the presidential residence. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit, guarded, quiet. At the end of a long hallway, a door opened. And there, standing beside a fireplace, hands clasped tightly behind his back, was the president of South Africa. He didn't smile. He didn't invite Saifo to sit. He just stared at him and said, "Why now?" Saifo answered with no hesitation. "Because we taught the world to forgive, but we never learned how to confess." The president closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, his voice colder now. "You understand what this letter does to our unity, to our image, to everything we built." Saifo stepped closer. "What you built on silence is not unity. It's denial." The fire crackled. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, finally, the president said, "You've opened a wound. Now you must help contain the bleeding." Saifo replied with a whisper, "Or maybe we let it bleed, just enough to feel alive again." The next morning, Saifo wasn't seen leaving the presidential residence. No camera caught it. No journalist reported it. As far as the public was concerned, the meeting never happened. But deep within the state archives, a single directive had already been issued: assess damage, identify collaborators, monitor Saifo Dlamini indefinitely. Somewhere in a dimly lit basement in Pretoria, a security operative opened an old steel drawer labeled 1994 Truth Commission Internal. Inside it, papers that were meant to be burned, files marked with Mandela's initials, testimonies that never made it to the final report, names of men still in power. At that same moment in the townships, elders began telling stories they hadn't dared to tell in decades, about betrayals, about deals made behind closed doors, about the night the truth became a performance. A storm was gathering, and Saifo knew it. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a prophet. He was just a man holding a letter that refused to die quietly. 48 hours later, Parliament opened under a cloud of tension so thick it choked every hallway. For the first time in years, the public gallery was full. Journalists, foreign observers, students, veterans, and somewhere among them, Saifo sat in the last row unnoticed, until the speaker struck the gavel. We will now hear the motion raised by the honorable member of the opposition regarding the Mandela letter incident. Gasps filled the chamber. The ruling party's front bench stiffened. Then slowly a woman stood, tall, calm, fierce. She was not a celebrity, not even a popular MP, but she was about to make history. "Mr. Speaker," she began, "we demand a full independent inquiry. This letter, written by Madiba himself, must not be swallowed by politics. The people deserve the truth, even if it shatters our myths." Thunderous applause from the gallery, silence from the majority. Then came the president's representative. He didn't deny the letter. He didn't question its authenticity. Instead, he looked directly at the gallery and said, "Unity requires memory, yes, but also discipline. We will not allow reckless excavation of the past to threaten the future." Saifo closed his eyes. He felt the words strike like cold metal. And yet, for the first time in decades, the chamber echoed with something unexpected: moral tension. Not over budgets, not over party loyalty, but over truth. That night, the nation watched as the letter was read again. This time not by Saifo, but by a child, a 12-year-old girl from Kailicha, standing in front of a classroom blackboard, filmed by a student documentary team. She spoke slowly, carefully, stumbling on some words, but her voice cut through the country like a blade of light. "To those who come after me, if ever silence becomes a weapon, then speaking, no matter how late, must become a duty." The footage aired on every major network. No music, no editing, just her voice and Madiba's words. On balconies in Cape Town, people stopped talking. In taxis in Johannesburg, passengers asked drivers to turn up the volume. In rural villages, elders whispered, "He wrote this, and they buried it?" In corporate towers, executives watched in silence, their smiles gone. A child had just done what no political leader had dared. She brought the nation back to Mandela. Not the statue, not the holiday. The man, with doubts, with regrets, with one last truth he wanted South Africa to hear. And now, there was no way to unhear it. Inside a private chamber at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the air is heavy. It's not the kind of room that sees much conversation, only contemplation. The former bodyguard, now aged and solemn, sits across from a panel of historians, journalists, and members of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. On the polished wooden table lies a small, leather-bound notebook. Its edges are worn. Its presence commands silence. A historian opens the notebook delicately, revealing densely written pages in Mandela's handwriting. At first, it seems like just a series of reflections, words of resilience, of peace, of forgiveness. But then the bodyguard points to one specific page. His voice breaks as he explains. He wrote this the night before his first speech after being released. But he never spoke these words publicly. He gave them to me and told me, "Maybe the world's not ready yet. What follows is not a speech filled with political triumph or reconciliation. It is raw emotion. Mandela speaks of moments when he doubted humanity, of nights when the darkness in his cell mirrored the darkness he felt in his heart. He confesses in his own hand, "There were days I wanted revenge more than peace, and that scared me, because if I could feel that anyone could." The room is still. Even recording devices seem hesitant to capture this side of the icon. So human, so haunted, so honest. One of the journalists quietly closes her notepad, her eyes welling up. A silence fills the room, not out of discomfort, but reverence. The bodyguard finally stands. His final words are barely above a whisper. Mandela wasn't perfect, and that's why he was powerful. This is the Mandela the world needed to meet. And as he walks out, leaving the notebook behind, one thing becomes clear. South Africa, and perhaps the world, was finally ready.